We hear all the time that huge economic inequality is just a fact of life now, an unavoidable side effect of things like technology and globalization. But what if that whole story is wrong? What if the deep divisions we feel in the United States weren't inevitable at all? What if there were actually a choice?
So let's start with a real head-scratcher, a paradox that sits at the center of everything. On a global scale, believe it or not, the world is actually becoming more equal in terms of income. So why then does the United States feel more fractured and divided than ever? Well, the answer to that question reveals something pretty startling.
First up, let's just lock in that surprising global trend, because honestly, it runs completely counter to what most of us probably assume is happening everywhere.
That's right. You heard that correctly. If you take a step back and look at the entire planet's population, the gap between the richest and poorest has actually been shrinking for decades. Now hang on to that fact, tuck it away, because it's the backdrop that makes what's happening in America so stark.
Okay, so if the world is getting more equal, let's zoom right back in on the US. There's this one economist, Peter Temin, who argues that to really understand what's going on, you have to realize that America doesn't just have one economy anymore, it has two. He calls this the dual economy, and it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's a model where the country is essentially split into two completely separate economic worlds. They're operating under different rules, and they are experiencing totally different realities. On one side, you have the prosperous FTE sector. That's finance, technology, and electronics. They're doing great, they're influential, and they absolutely shape policy to help themselves out. And on the other side, you've got the low-wage sector. And here's the kicker. This is actually the largest part of the economy, but their incomes are completely stagnant, and they're basically living under the rules set by that other wealthier group. That is the real source of the division we all feel. Okay, so if America has this deep internal split, how does that possibly fit with the world that's getting more equal? Let's zoom back out for a second to really get the mechanics of this huge global shift. Here is where things get really interesting. The location of inequality is what's changing. While the gap within many countries, including the US, is getting wider, the gap between countries is shrinking. And that second trend, the one between countries, is so powerful it actually pulls the entire global average toward more equality. So what's driving this big squeeze between nations? It's primarily the incredible, explosive economic growth in China and India. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people who have seen their incomes rise dramatically, and that has closed the gap with the developed world in a massive way. But, and this is a huge but, those exact same forces of globalization and technology are having the complete opposite effect inside developed countries. For the wealthiest folks, it's opened up huge new markets and created enormous opportunities. But for workers in those semi-skilled jobs, it's brought crushing international competition and automation that's just hollowed out the middle class. The economist Branko Milanovic has a name for the group that's been hit the hardest by all this. He says it's the lower middle class of the developed world. They are the ones who have seen their economic security just completely erode because of these powerful twin forces. All right, this is where the whole story really clicks into place. Technology and globalization. These are global forces, so you'd think they would affect all developed nations in a pretty similar way, right? Well, what if I told you they didn't? Now get this, because this is kind of a bombshell. That economic shock from technology, that hollowing out of middle-class jobs we just talked about, was actually more severe in Europe than it was here in the United States. And that, right there, leads us to the million-dollar question. If that underlying economic force was actually stronger over in Europe, then why did the United States end up with a much, much larger increase in income inequality? The logic just seems completely backwards. I mean, just think about what this is telling us. The US had a smaller technological shock, but got a massive surge in inequality. Europe had a stronger shock, but their rise in inequality was way more moderate. This tells us something absolutely crucial. Technology isn't the whole story here, not by a long shot. Something else is going on. And that something else is politics. The difference in outcomes wasn't sealed by economics. It was determined by the political choices each side made in response to those same economic forces. As the economist Anthony Atkinson put it so well, technological progress is not a force of nature. It's not like the weather. It reflects the social and economic decisions that we make. Our choices can fundamentally influence where technology goes, and therefore, how the income is distributed. And that is exactly what happened. In the face of these huge shifts, many European nations put policies into place to support workers, to cushion the blow, and to moderate the rise in inequality. The United States, for the most part, did not. It simply chose a different path. So why? Well, the source material points to some things that are unique to the American experience. A long and fraught history of racial division, for one, and a political tendency to create us versus them narratives. These factors made it much harder to build the kind of broad social solidarity that you need to protect everyone. So instead of bringing people together, these divisions just allowed those two economies, the FTE and the low-wage sectors, to drift further and further apart into their own separate worlds. So look, the most important thing to take away from all of this is that America's severe inequality and its fractured dual economy are not inevitable. They aren't just a natural byproduct of progress. They are the direct result of political choices, a different path that was chosen again and again for decades. But that simple fact that this was all a choice is actually incredibly empowering. It means the future is not set in stone. Because if our political choices created the economy we have today, well, it leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? What choices will we make to redefine it for tomorrow?